And so we need to begin to understand that that when I talk about this whole question of when some people utilize a certain kind of mode of dress, say the miniskirt versus the hijab or the niqab, people are emphasizing different values. In utilizing the miniskirt, for instance, someone is emphasizing their right to exercise freedom above all. Where other people are saying, well, we're going to cover our hair, we're going to listen to tradition, or we're going to listen to religion, then they are giving obedience to tradition. So on the one hand, it is freedom. On the other hand, it is obedience to tradition. And so people make choices of what value in what instance they are going to prefer. And these issues are not soluble through reason, and they are not soluble either through religion. And therefore, Islam, for instance, builds in this notion of plurality. So, for instance, in Muslim legal theory, which is moral philosophy, for instance, there are two schools of thought on some of the questions of the moral truth. And some believe that there's only a singular moral truth, and others believe that there are multiple moral truths, and that we cannot decide on the singularity and one can never know what is the truth. And therefore Muslims have developed an understanding that says al-mujtahidu idha ijtahada fa-asab falahu ajran wa in akhta falahu ajrun wahid, that someone, an intellectual, a jurist, a scholar who deliberates and emphasizes and put energy into thinking through a complex issue, if they make that effort and they get it right, they get 2 rewards, and if they get it wrong, they get 1 reward. In other words, the intellectual effort, when you put in intellectual effort, you can come up with multiple answers, including wrong answers, but you will never know the wrong answers in this world. Only God knows the right answer. And hence, that is called the infallibilist position in Islamic moral theory, and therefore it is open a certain kind of pluralism. So I favor value pluralism, and we affirm that each side has access to moral knowledge. This requires giving up the notion of the truth of norms or of ethical truth. That requires a whole new shift, that there's a singular truth of norms, or there's one ethical truth. Is no longer that possible. To allow that the good becomes plural is to allow the potential for conflict, and therefore there is no one solution to such conflicts. So when you do say, for instance, that the good is multiple, then you do open up a potential for multiple goods contesting each other. And there's a conflict. But again, you don't have one solution for these conflicts. So we face hard questions, for instance, on questions of sexual choice, monogamy and polygamy, serial polygamy. How do we adjudicate on these issues? Parda, niqab, absolute personal liberties, blasphemy to some, freedom of speech for other, modesty questions. How do we reconcile these kinds of viable claims? To say that values are incommensurable is not to say that all ways of life have equal value. To value pluralism is to argue that there is a diversity of goods and a diversity of evils. Different ways of life can more or less find their own ways of achieving universal goods, of mitigating universal evils and resolving conflicts among them. And we are now, for instance, in this day and age, facing in this biopolitical stage of global politics, the tyranny of the singular. And so when you have those multiple goods, you must find a way, a modus vivendi, that you will never agree on what are the multiple goods, but therefore we need to agree to disagree, and therefore we have what we call a modus vivendi. And this is an idea that I take from the moral philosopher and political theorist John Gray. Muslims thinkers in the past, for instance, like Al-Ghazali, who dies in 1111, for instance, have helped us a great deal in thinking through this question about interpretation and how does one interpret text that teaches us morality and moral values. One of the things that Ghazali says in a very important book called Qanun al-Ta'wil, that is the canon of interpretation, he gives you many passages, difficult passages from the Quran and prophetic tradition that might on the surface of it look very difficult and very problematic. Ghazali works through all that, and he comes and provides for us a very eloquent and a very helpful triangle that if we utilize a triangle in terms of our intellectual work, we might be able to go quite a way in the way of pursuing and furthering the idea of plural interpretations and plural ways of understanding the good. So the triangle that Ghazali identifies is that they must be intention. So the first point he says, don't refute reason. That's point number one. Don't reject reason, don't refute reason. Without reason, you cannot have any conversation, a meaningful conversation. The second point he says, bear in mind when you're interpreting, he says, that you don't claim and never claim to know all. Always know that what you know today is what is your intellectual harvest today, that tomorrow it might change, and that you in your capacity might not be able to encompass all. So don't show some intellectual humility, that knowledge is endless and understanding is endless. So don't refute reason, and you don't know all, that must be intention. And the third angle of the tension is that when you have multiplicity of interpretations, don't only hang on to one and to the exclusion of all the others. To be open to the possibility that this is my interpretation, but it is possible that you can arrive at another one. When you have that, you keep that intention. Isn't that a very eloquent way of dealing with this? That don't refute reason, that you don't claim to know all, and that one always thinks about that the point or the piece that I hold on to is the piece that the way I understood it, and all the other pieces might also be equally valuable. To make pluralism possible, we need an ethics of accountability. To make pluralism possible, and when societies go through transitions, moving away from despotism, from autocratic rule, to pluralistic democracy, you need an ethics of accountability, you need a liberalism of coexistence, we also need a regime of reconciliation. You need to be able to reconcile between people that are at loggerheads with each other. And that is what I'm going to say in the next part of my presentation, and spend a bit of time on the ethics of accountability. Most, if not almost, all ethical communities and systems of moral reasoning, they all recognize some notion of responsibility and accountability. And ethics of responsibility is not only the burden to be shouldered by an individual, and this is very important, that ethics of responsibility starts with the individual, but I'm beginning to argue that in the globalizing world, and we now have different kinds of globalization, that I believe that beyond the law, larger collectivities, especially nations and countries, ought to be held accountable for their actions as part of an ethic of responsibility. So you cannot let certain countries get off and run away and say, because we are powerful, we can do so. We also now need an ethics of responsibility that we hold larger entities responsible. And today we are living in a world that the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai talks about, that we had two kinds of globalization. The one kind of globalization that we had was called vertebral globalization. Vertebral globalization is the one in which the global, like the backbone, its vertebral is all connected, and there's a central nervous system and there's central messaging. But he believes that that kind of globalization is something of the past. The new kind of globalization is what he calls cellular globalization. Cellular globalization happens, what many of you are doing right now, sending WhatsApp, sending messages to different people, sending emails, making notes. It goes on to your various devices. It happens without central messaging. People are making connections without any central backbone. You have friends in Latin America, you have networks that are no longer predictable, and that's called cellular globalization. And so what is happening is that in this environment of cellular globalization, it's a different kind of a ball game, and we need to think about, and in fact I believe that the very nature of cellular globalization creates the possibility for pluralism in ways that we never had it before. And there's no way that you can even manage that pluralism. So you might as well begin to recognize it, and once we recognize it, we can also talk about it And we can also then, by talking about it, there's accountability and responsibility. So you don't let kids or militants, or prevent them sending messages to chat rooms to talk about where the next bombing exercise is going to be, what they're going to destroy next. So once you have this kind of accountability within cellular globalization, then people in those chat rooms will report them and identify the wrongdoers. And therefore, if you have an ethics of accountability that can penetrate cellular globalization, you're going in the right direction. But you must espouse, in order to get there, in order to securitize cellular globalization, you must admit to pluralism, to variety. You must allow people to be able to engage in cellular globalization, so that you can also there then be able to police it, so that it does not become damaging and threatening to humanity. And today, we are all threatened by global warming and ecological threats. And this is the point that I'm making, that, not individuals, but also larger entities and communities and nations and states are accountable. Global warming teaches us, and we have now an awareness of global warming like never ever before, that we must share responsibility and there must be collective accountability as stewards of the globe. One country cannot put out all the greenhouse gases to destroy the forests of Latin America or Africa. We cannot do that anymore, and hence, again, in order to have a globalized world, in order to have a pluralistic way of life, we must, as a matter of necessity, also create a means of shared responsibility and collective accountability. Now, Sufis and mystics have an arresting way of explaining complex themes, complex issues, with their successful use of imagery. And they use this imagery and parables in order to drive home the point. And I'm going to make this next point to begin to think about and work with you on this question of how one can think about the question of what can one achieve if we are accountable and if we are responsible. Jalaluddin Rumi, who died in 1273, the great mystic, reminded us to be aware of those who obfuscate reality and urge us not to be intimidated. And Rumi urges us to not be intimidated by our own fears. No matter how large and dreaded the challenge, human beings do have the ability to overcome and conquer. But if we do not confront the challenge, then indeed the problem will metastasize. Rumi uses the parable of the snake. A snake is known for its deadly venom in most cases. But something more happens if the snake is not confronted, Rumi says. I quote Rumi. Rumi says, "It is said that when a snake does not see a human being for 40 years, it turns into a dragon. That is, it sees no one who would cause its evil and vileness to melt." I'm still quoting Rumi. "A big lock indicates that there is something valuable and costly inside the place where the serpent is guarding. There's something valuable behind it. The great obfuscation, the better the essence, the better the essence. The more the obfuscation, the better the essence. Like a serpent guarding a treasure trove. Don't look at the ugliness of the serpent, look at the value of the treasure." End of quote. Now this is a fairly complex parable that Rumi has sketched for us. Let me try and unpack it. One moral from Rumi's multivalent uses of parables can be the following reading that I would provide. If one does not confront a problem, then a venomous but comparatively harmless snake can turn into a dragon to become a bigger problem. For Rumi, the serpent or the snake is a metaphor for the animal soul or the lower soul, the animal soul, the lower self. If this self that often covets everything is left unrestrained, then it will turn into a dragon. Hence Rumi says, the inner workings of the human being, the inner dimensions of the human being, is predisposed to go out of control and therefore requires constant vigilance and regulation. Since no human being confronted the snake for 40 years, namely did not confront the lower self to curb it of its vileness, it turned into something more grotesque, into a dragon. Now the human being will need a rare talent in order to combat the menacing dragon. Instead of needing the elementary skills of being a snake charmer, now you need to have the strength and you need to have the Herculean task of becoming a dragon slayer. Yet it is worth killing the snake or the dragon, Rumi says, for the dividends are rich. Often in Rumi stories, the serpent guards a precious treasure of emeralds that are often found in ruined buildings and homes. You know, people flee or leave and the house is in ruins and there's always serpents there, but behind the serpent there are huge treasures of emeralds and valuable jewelry. Those emeralds are the gems that make a human being, and for Rumi those emeralds are the capacity to love. And this is the essence of the human being, the capacity to love. Of course, the treasure in every instance could be different, and thus it is situational. When Rumi is applied to our context, then the dragon guards the treasure of love or the treasure of coexistence. With love comes responsibility, and for 21st century people of all faiths, Muslims and Jews and Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and others, there is nothing greater than the question of responsibility and accountability. And if it means that in order to acquire responsibility, one has to be exposed to some risk, like you're going to kill the dragon, you're going to be the dragon slayer or the killer of the serpent, then the Rumi encourages us to make that leap and to be courageous and become the dragon slayers in order to unleash the potential of love and its consequences that human beings can benefit from. Instead of being intimidated by the ferocity of the snake turned dragon, he encourages us to value the treasure. If people are derelict in their responsibilities, then the Muslim tradition treats such disregard of duty to be the equivalent of the Day of Judgment. In a famous tradition, the Prophet Muhammad said, إِذَا ضُيِّعَتِ الْأَمَانَةُ فَانْتَظِرُوا السَّاعَةِ, that when responsibility, amana, is destroyed, then surely expect the hour of judgment. When he was asked, how can responsibility be destroyed, he provided a devastating but insightful explanation. Responsibility, he implied, is not willy-nilly destroyed. Responsibility doesn't get destroyed overnight. Responsibility is much more complex and robust. Responsibility is established through elaborate processes of institutions and networks of trust, obligations and responsibilities. It's a complex thing. All these things must hang together for responsibility to work in communities and societies and so on. And human beings are responsible and accountable for what they do. Hence, in reply to the question, how responsibility is destroyed, the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, replied, when matters are entrusted to the incompetent, then expect the hour. Responsibility begins with competence. So often, when we find ourselves in narrow straits, when we find ourselves against the wall, when people go for despotism and for authoritarian options and for non-pluralistic ways of life, you do know that a massive incompetence has preceded this. And therefore, you need to watch to see that when responsibility is destroyed, you need to see what kind of competence has gone in. If there is competence, responsibility will stay. Responsibility and accountability will create and innovate possibilities. But when you have incompetence, the entire infrastructure is destroyed and soon you will have nothing except brute power. So could, in an effort to sustain a liberalism of coexistence that I talked about earlier, can one have a liberalism of coexistence without accountability and responsibility? In my view, no. And since I said that this is not only happens at the national level, but this also happens at the global level, I want to argue that there should be today in our world a global solidarity of responsible people and the alliances of competent people. Even if one is agnostic about Western governments, in their conduct, especially toward Muslim majority countries and the Muslim world, one must ensure that the alliances and solidarities in America and Europe's civil societies will be rooted in an ethic of responsibility, preceded by trust and competence. So if governments in Western Europe and North America are incompetent and doing irresponsible things, I believe one must have solidarity with the civil societies of Europe and North America, where people are much more effective and are much more interested in having a safe world for themselves. It is at that level that individuals and communities will identify their interest in global solidarity and begin their reconciliation with communities and individuals of their choice on a global scale. Already thousands of courageous Americans and Europeans are engaged in self-questioning their countries' imperial and unethical global postures, which is, and therefore we can think now, if people from this part of the world also in their movement and mobilization of civil society move out to create global solidarity, that will lead to the greater good, and that will lead to, again, to a coexistence of liberalism or a certain kind of coexistence. Similarly, citizens of Muslim majority countries and those living in minority contexts can earnestly engage in a reconciliation processes with citizens elsewhere in the world. Surely in a world of cellular globalization, relationships of trust and responsibility at a people-to-people level would prove to be a giant step in the right direction. Muslims located in countries like India, Nigeria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, South Africa, the United States and Israel, for instance, could take the lead. Often these are deeply divided societies and are in dire need for reconciliation. Here Muslims of goodwill, but also Hindus and Buddhists, Christians and others, can become key role players in cellular globalization for the good, rather than cellular globalization in pursuit of nefarious ends of terror that the foot soldiers of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria so earnestly pursue. Reconciliation demands a radical reconciliation, and if you want to do a liberalism and pluralism of coexistence in a serious way, it demands a radical posture of self-critique. It begins with self-critique. And those of us living in different parts of the world, especially those of us like people like myself living in North America, we might have to engage in even a more rigorous self-scrutiny. Self-critique can begin with the longer memory of the past in mind or a more immediate context. Take, for instance, I'll just give you one example. Take the attitude of the West, and with America in the lead, insisting that the nations of the global South disarm and get rid of nuclear weapons, especially there's a whole focus on Iran and North Korea. In the streets of different parts of the global South, this demand of the West is met with by many people with a certain amount of dismay and great questioning. They range from the questions such as, is the US not the owner of the largest stockpile of the most advanced weapons of mass destruction? Was the US not the first country in human history to use a devastating atomic bomb to kill thousands of civilians, not combatants, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Furthermore, the US frequently tries to undermine the most effective international instrument to combat global political violence done by governments, namely the International Criminal Court of Justice, formed to prosecute dictators and international terrorists for war crimes. In other words, if one returns to Rumi's parable, then surely even nations are like serpents who have morphed into dragons and are out of control. We need to slay dangerous dragons through argument. Of course, I'm not asking you to be violent, but through argument and through moral discussion. Reconciliation does not only involve the need to identify the causes of moral and political harm, but it must simultaneously involve self-correction, self-improvement, and social reform. Muslim countries, especially at the level of individual, community, and society, will have to take the lead in changing their own conditions. Such change begins with governance, in the first instance. The lack of good and responsible governance creates a growing pool of disgruntled and frustrated people in Muslim societies whose futures are bleak, if not non-existent. I just read in this morning's paper that you, Malaysia, you have the honor of providing a second Malaysian as a suicide bomber for ISIS. These people, of young people, become these pools of young people become the incubators for radicalism that morphs into frightening swamps of militancy and terror. In several Muslim countries, attention will have to be given to the next point, the treatment of religious minorities. Platitudes will not be sufficient. Discriminatory laws and practices that make non-Muslim minorities into effective second-class citizens in countries like Pakistan, Egypt, I don't know what the situation of minorities in Malaysia, so I won't comment, you can tell me better. Iran and Saudi Arabia, to mention a few, but a few are intolerable the way the practices go. Ordinary citizens, it is the duty of ordinary citizens who are sitting here, will have to be empowered in order to show zero tolerance for autocratic regimes and discriminatory treatment. But such change can only take place if people in those very societies promote transformation according to their own values and standards. And liberal coexistence or pluralism must strive to get the best out of people working with their local cultures. So I'm almost sure that if you look into Malay culture, into Chinese culture, into Indian culture, in a country like this, you will find resources for pluralism. You will find resources for liberal coexistence. Many Muslim countries might have to consider establishing truth and reconciliation tribunals, like South Africa, in order to come to grips with atrocities of the past, acts of genocide and massacres undertaken by governments and military rulers and political kleptocrats and political autocrats. The disclosure of past atrocities might be sufficient and more healing rather than Nuremberg-style justice for offenders, so that you can create, so that you don't create further division. So I'm arguing that when you have reconciliation, you do it a la South Africa, where the people who have done wrong must confess to their wrong, own up and do disclosures, and then that will be a certain kind of, provide them some kind of amnesty. Because if you're going to further prosecute those people, and then you're going to have tribunals after tribunal a la Nuremberg, it could be divisive. But you must take it very seriously. At least that's my point of view. These kinds of procedures will set the gold standard for accountable governance so that future rulers can be held responsible for their deeds. Let me conclude to say that in the Islamic tradition, this idea of being creative and finding resources from within human societies from multiple places has a beautiful parable in the Quran. The Quran says that وَأَوْحَى رَبُّكَ إِلَى النَّحْلِ أَنِ اتَّخِذِي مِنَ الْجِبَالِ بُيُوتًا وَمِنَ الشَّجَرِ وَمِمَّا يَعْرِشُونَ ثُمَّ كُلِي مِنْ كُلِّ الثَّمَرَاتِ فاسلكي سبل ربك ذللا يخرج من بطونها شراب مختلف ألوانه فيه شفاء للناس إن في ذلك لآية لقوم يتفكرون. That your Lord inspired the bee and told the bee that it must make a home in every tree and in every mountain and every trellis. And then he told the bee that go out and collect from all the fruits. Fasluki subala rabbiki dhulala, and then walk humbly in the path of your Lord. And then the verse says that comes out from the belly of the bee a beverage of multiple colors and hues, and then it says in it there is a remedy for humanity. Indeed, this parable, it says, is a sign for people who wish to think. And this is important, that the honeybee has to take from the diversity to create something new. Everyone works hard, like every worker bee works hard and creates the possibility. And then is the fruit. Many people think that the fruit or the remedy, that the honey is a remedy, is basically the, all the virtues of honey, how good honey is. Sure, that is important, but it has another meaning. That in this kind of action, where multiple people, different people work together, take from different places to make something new, this effort of a plurality of humanity working together to create something new, that is the remedy. That kind of working, that kind of making of society, of differences that are held together to produce something extraordinary, that is the remedy. That is the shifa that the verse is pointing to. And this requires a people who think. I thank you very much for your patience. I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think I'd like to open the floor for discussion. I'll just take 3 questions first. introduce yourself and you can direct the question to Prof. Thank you.
Okay, the minister was asked this morning in the Senate about the insults to Islam. This is what he replied. The teachings of liberalism and pluralism are seen as among the most prevalent forms of insult to Islam recently. And he says he has identified, although he has not identified, he said the government has identified the forms of insult based on reports by the Islamic bodies. However, he did not state how many cases of insult were attributed to such teaching. So I would like to hear what your views of Professor Moosa.
Hi, Prof. I'm Chin Huat from Penang Institute. You reminded us that the idea of good is too complex to be singular. The idea of good life is too complex to be singular. But I think often people who preach singularity of what is good and so on do so for extrinsic reason. For example, they feel threatened as a community because if between the community people have different views of what is good, then you cannot have unity, communal unity against the others. I think that's really the problem in Malaysia here. That the whole idea that why you need a single interpretations of Islam, as YB Zahiri pointed out earlier, is the fear that Islam is being threatened, Muslims are being threatened by non-Muslims, even though that the percentage of Muslims is now above 60%. So how do you deal with that kind of fear, that kind of insecurity, victimhood, that the under siege mentality? Thank you.
Mustafa Jamboy, I have a question. You know, every religion, I mean, you have mentioned about the understanding and so on and so forth, the pluralism, the issue of the honeybees and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, each religion goes and says that it has to, for that matter, that I am the way, this is the only way. In spite of all the what YB stated at the very beginning, which he quoted the ayat from the Quran, which is very correct, nevertheless, the Quran does say very clearly, say not Trinity, desist. Shirk, have no other gods besides me. The Old Testament says, I am a jealous God. Thou shalt not have any other gods besides me. Christ comes along and says, this is the way, I am the way. So, all religions do have this sort of exclusivity preached by their messengers, which contradicts what YB and what our honorable guest had to say this evening. Can you reconcile this? Thank you.